And let me give a precursor to it. I want to just, maybe it's a disclaimer, but I want to say this, that my allegiance is not towards any particular translation of the Bible. I think sometimes people can get this thing where they like, it's kind of like liking a football team or something like that. It's like, well, you don't actually play for the team. You don't have anything to do with the team. You just spend money on their gear and watch their games, right? It's not like in the same way, people can build their identity on, well, I'm this translation and I'm this translation. Listen, I think that we should all be reading a lot of translations, but our fidelity, my fidelity, and I think everybody, should be to the original text. We believe that the original text is inspired.
All right, well, welcome to Sermon Extra. We're here with Pastor Nick Cady, pastor of Whitefields Community Church in Longmont, Colorado. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sermon that was preached this Sunday. It was a sermon in Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through the end of the chapter. The title of the message was Mustard Seed Faith. So obviously that suggests that we're going to talk a little bit about faith today. But there's some other things we want to dive into from the text and maybe what's not in the text, and we're going to look at that and see what Nick has to say about that. Before we get started, we want to encourage you to interact with the content. So if you're on YouTube, Facebook, wherever you're at, interact with the content by leaving a comment, ask a question we can use on another episode. Hit the like button, share it if you can, but make sure you subscribe so that the next time we post content, you'll be the first one to be able to watch that. And you'll just stay up with our series through the Gospel of Matthew and diving deeper into topics that we don't have time to talk about on Sunday mornings. So definitely download the Whitefields Community Church app. That's where you'll have all the content, past sermons. So if you missed this last week's sermon, you can catch up there. So definitely do that. And so let's dive into the text. And so to set the stage, Matthew chapter 17 starts with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And Jesus is with three of his disciples. He's transfigured before them. And it is an amazing experience. The disciples are just blown away. They said, let's just stay here forever. But the chapter continues and they come down off the mountain. And as soon as they come down off the mountain, they're faced with reality. So just maybe kind of reiterate that part of it, and then we'll get into some of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, really important to remember that the purpose of going up on the mountain wasn't to get away from the people forever. But Jesus is here for a mission. He's come for a purpose, and he's called his disciples to a specific calling. He's called them to be salt and light in the world. He's also empowered them to be his ambassadors in the world for his kingdom, to be special representatives, envoys of him. And so the idea that they would stay away from people experiencing, the four of them experiencing something amazing is really antithetical to the whole reason why Jesus came. And that's also true for us as disciples today. That I think there can be sometimes a tendency for people to say, it's just so much easier. Life is so much easier if you don't have to deal with people and situations and things like that. Wouldn't it be just so much better to live in like a constant state of retreat, right? Just me and God. And by the way, people throughout history have pursued that very thing. But I would again say, I think it's antithetical to the calling that we have as disciples, which is we're no longer just living for ourselves. We're ambassadors of the kingdom called to be salt and light, and you can't do that from a distance.
Yeah, I liked what you said on Sunday where salt has to be in, it has to get in the mix. You can't season something, can't preserve something if the salt is over here and that object is over there. It's got to be part of the mix. So that's good. It's a good picture for us to know that we have a purpose out in the world. Spend time with Jesus and then be out in the world as lights. You don't hide your light under a bushel. You got to let it shine. So okay, so we get into this where there's there's something wild going on. There's a demon possessed guy, and he's got all these symptoms and things. And the disciples, they're attempting to help, it seems, but then the result is they aren't able to help this guy, and Jesus does. But it seems like the issue is their faith. They lack faith. So is that So I guess talk about maybe why or what that was, and then how Jesus kind of almost expresses some frustration with the disciples.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus expresses frustration right away. He said, but his frustration isn't just with the disciples, but definitely it's also with the disciples specifically. But his specific frustration with these 9 disciples who were left down below the mountain when the other 3 went up with Jesus, it pours over into a general frustration, which is he's saying, how long am I going to be with you guys? Like, it's got to be so frustrating for the King of the universe, the one who has all power, one who, has been showing people these things and these miracles over and over, to constantly be bumping into the fact that people have a lack of faith. And they have lack of faith in him, lack of faith in his power, his ability, or his willingness. And so I think it's important for us to consider this, like that the way that we interact with God is through faith. Faith shapes the way that we pray to God. It shapes the actions that we do practically in our lives. And it's really important to remember what it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, where it says that without faith, it is impossible to please God. In other words, faith pleases God. Lack of faith frustrates God. And that's exactly what we see in this situation. Now, on the other hand, you can take this to an extreme, which I would just say is summed up with the idea of having faith in your faith. I think that faith in your faith is misplaced faith. You can have faith in lots of things that are misplaced. And, you could think of probably many examples throughout the years when people have put a lot of faith in something that was not worthy of their faith. It didn't deserve their faith, and that faith being misplaced in that thing led to disastrous consequences in some cases, or just simple disappointment. On the other hand, small faith in a powerful thing, a capable thing, a thing that's worthy of your trust, will lead to a good outcome, even if your faith is small. One quick example, maybe you've seen these videos of there's this like bridge made of glass in China. And it's really interesting to watch these people who go out on this bridge and they have almost no faith in this bridge and they are scared to death. And yet the reality is they're perfectly safe because the bridge has been tested, it's been engineered, they're perfectly safe. It has the ability to hold them, even though they doubt its ability to hold them. So if you have a little bit of faith in something strong, the something strong is still going to take care of you. But you still got to have at least enough faith to walk. I mean, you got to give it to these people. They don't have a lot of faith. They're scared, but they're still doing it. Sure. So I think that's a good example, actually.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
I remember stepping out at the Willis Tower in Chicago, formerly the Sears Tower, tallest building, whatever. And then they've got these glass cubes that stick out from the building. And so you can get out there and look straight down at the street. And so, you've got to have a little bit of faith to step out there. And my strategy was just don't look down.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So Jesus was disappointed with the lack of faith. But fast forward now, modern day, is Jesus disappointed with me? Is he disappointed with you?
Yeah.
Is he disappointed with people that are having doubts?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. And here's how I would define it. How do you know if Jesus is pleased with you or not? Well, again, it gets the idea of little is a relative term. So is big, right? Put it this way. Another thing I brought up in the sermon, which I think is really important, it's something that I don't hear talked about very much. And so I like to bring it up from time to time. And it's this point that twice in the Bible, in the New Testament, both from the Apostle Paul in his writings, he talks about making progress in the faith. In other words, if you have a small amount of faith, but you're just getting started, right? We see Jesus having a lot of compassion towards people who they're just getting started. They don't have it all figured out. Maybe they're just learning to walk in faith. There's a lot of patience, a lot of compassion. And why is he so frustrated with these disciples? Because by this point, they should know better. They should be further along. They've seen him do these miracles where he's fed multitudes more than once. They've seen him walk on the water. They know now who he is. We've had this declaration and this discussion determining who he is. They should be able to trust a little bit more than what they're currently doing. And there's one other aspect to this, is that Jesus had given these 12 specifically a unique empowerment and calling in Matthew chapter 10, which he hadn't given to everybody. And therefore we could maybe say, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's given that exact thing to us today. So you say, well, I don't know if I could do that thing. Well, okay, but let's remember they were given a unique, specific calling for a unique, specific season. And we talked about that in Matthew chapter 10, that not everything in that passage directly applies to us, but there are principles which apply to us. Now, we can say this in this case, that certainly he wants us to have faith. Certainly he wants us to be making progress in our faith. And I think, therefore, probably there are times when I have frustrated the Lord with my lack of faith. There have probably been also other times when, in a relatively small area, where I've had faith, where he's been pleased, right? So I think it depends on where you're at and how far along you are.
So does that frustration cause a temporary denied access to the Lord? How does it affect our relationship with him?
Yeah, I don't think it cuts you off from access to the Lord. I think it's one of these things where, listen, anybody who has kids knows what it's like to see your kid do something and think, or even say to them, you really should be a little bit further along in this thing or this area by now. And yeah, I don't know if I even want to use the word disappointment, but maybe frustrated, or that kind of angst that says, okay, we should be doing better by now. Let's work on this type of thing. Now, maybe that's me projecting, but that's the way that I process it and receive it. That God isn't writing you off. He's not saying, you messed up and I'm done with you. This is a walk. It's a process. He's a father. You're his child. And as a child, as a good father, he is trying to take you and move you from where you are to where he wants you to be. And sometimes he's frustrated, maybe, in cases where you should have made some progress, but that frustration doesn't lead to, all right, you're cut off. I'm done with you. I'm going to go find somebody better. Yeah.
All right. So without faith, it's impossible to please God. So I want to please God. I mean, I think we all want to please God. So where does faith come from? How do I get more of it so I can be pleasing to him more consistently?
Yeah, okay, a few ways. How do we get faith? Well, one way is we know that faith is sometimes imparted to us directly by God. That's important to keep in mind. Faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit. And I think that when it talks about that, it's about I would say like an unusual measure of faith. It's faith to do something God has called you to do, which requires a degree of faith. On a more general level, we know from the Bible, faith comes by hearing from the word of Christ. That's Romans chapter 10. Our faith is built as we hear testimonies of God's faithfulness on the one hand, and as we personally experience God's faithfulness on the other hand. That's why if you want to build your faith, spend time in the word of God, spend time with the people of God, and take steps of faith.
Yeah, I mean, the chapter 17, the takeaway from the transfiguration was, this is my beloved son, hear him. Mm-hmm. Right? What did he say? What is he going to say? Whatever he says, hear him, because that's where your faith is rooted. Is faith comes by hearing by the word of God. So, yeah. Okay. So before we move into one of the, I think, the bigger questions, I just want to ask the simple question of, does this scenario that we're talking about, where there's somebody's possessed with a demon and then casting out the demon, and you kind of even mentioned, the Matthew 10, and there's an empowerment, but does this sort of thing happen today? Are there still people that are possessed, and then do Christians have the ability to cast out demons?
Yeah, I would say the answer to that is yes. And I think that in our modern day and age, it can be really, it can be hard to know, what's a mental health issue? What's a physiological issue? What is a spiritual issue? How are those things mixed? I did an interview on my podcast a couple months ago in the spring of this year, 2024, with a gentleman, and I think I have his book back there somewhere, but I don't want to go digging through it right now in the video because I'm not sure exactly where it is on my shelf. But he is a pastor, and he has also had some training in mental health care and things like that. And I asked him that question: how do you tell the difference between what maybe somebody would look at today and say, well, that person has, this and that disorder, versus in the Bible where we read about people who had demonic possession. And he said it's, in his mind, way more intertwined than, it's not just like one or the other. And I think that requires a lot of wisdom. I think it requires a lot of leading by the Holy Spirit. And it's like, Lord, help me to know what is the thing that is needed in this case. But yes, I do believe that through Jesus' name, he's empowered us to even still do that work of casting out demons or to pray for spiritual protection, those sorts of things.
All right, so here's the big one.
All right.
Okay, especially for those
Let's do it.
King James folks, New King James, which I've got one here, and this is what I use. But the question is, verse 21 in Matthew chapter 17 is not in your version, which is the ESV. So why is it missing? Why is it here? And you take a verse like this, which says, however, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting, and say, so that wasn't in the original, or is that something that was taken out? And some translations just decided to willy-nilly I just don't like that verse. And we might even look at it and say, well, yeah, I mean, if we're going to lose a verse, maybe that's not the worst one to lose, prayer and fasting, that type of thing. But then you get into chapter 18, and all of a sudden there's a verse that, Jesus came to seek and save that which is lost. And don't take that one away, because that one is also absent from some of the modern translations. So let's talk about that. Help us understand.
It's a really good question. And let me give a precursor to it. I want to maybe it's a disclaimer, but I want to say this, that my allegiance is not towards any particular translation of the Bible. I think sometimes people can get this thing where they like, it's kind of like liking a football team or something like that. It's like, well, you don't actually play for the team. You don't have anything to do with the team. You just spend money on their gear and watch their games, right? It's not like in the same way, people can build their identity on, well, I'm this translation and I'm this translation. Listen, I think that we should all be reading a lot of translations, but our fidelity, my fidelity, and I think everybody's, should be to the original text. We believe that the original text is inspired. Now, we also believe that it's okay to translate the Bible, and it should be translated into other languages so that people can hear it and read it. But we understand that when it comes to translation, there's a lot going on. One of the things that's going on is source documents. That's what we're going to be talking about here in a moment. Another one is, what does language mean? Does language change over time? Is that good or is that bad? How should we treat it? And so there's a lot of things that go into it. So let me just put it this way before we say anything else. My allegiance is not to this translation or that translation or any other English translation. My allegiance is to the text that was inspired by God as it was originally written. Now, I can read Greek, but I'm not good at it, right? Like I can do it. I generally do every week, read the original text, but let's say I don't understand it 100% like I speak English. So I'm reliant on translations and translation tools. I'm thankful for the translations we have. And I would just encourage everybody out there, understand how translation works and have your allegiance be to the original text. Now, that being said, there are two groups of source documents that are generally used. One is called the authorized text. The other one is called the received text, okay? Now, you don't really need to remember that. What you need to know is this. The authorized text was given, it's based on a set of manuscripts that was assembled in the early 1500s, like literally like 1500, in the first 10 years of the 1500s. Those documents were assembled by a man named Diodorus Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a friend of the reformers. A lot of people would say he was kind of a reformer, but he didn't go as far as the reformers in actually departing from the Catholic Church as an institution. Now, this man, though, he's generally pretty highly regarded, and he was a very wealthy man, and he used his wealth to travel the area around the Eastern Mediterranean, so it's like Alexandria in Egypt and some parts of like what's now modern-day Israel and Lebanon and Turkey. And what is he doing? He's collecting old documents, trying to get the oldest manuscripts and reliable, and as many as he can, so they can be compared against each other. And, we have over 5,000 manuscripts from the New Testament that have been assembled over the last 2,000 years. But what Erasmus did is that he, rather than translating from the Latin, which is how the Catholic Church was doing it, they had created this Latin Vulgate, which was a translation of the original text into Latin. And then when they would translate the Bible into other languages, they wouldn't translate from the original texts. They would translate from Latin. Now, Erasmus said, no, remember, this is the time of the Renaissance. We need to go ad fontes, which means in Latin, back to the sources. So what is the source? Well, the source is the original Greek, and then for the Old Testament, let's also check the Hebrew document. Now, those were much easier to find because the Jewish people were very meticulous in keeping these documents. Now, the Christians were pretty meticulous too, but they were spread around the world. These guys were in Europe, remember? He's from Rotterdam. That's in the Netherlands. But he was in communication with people like Martin Luther and John Calvin and these kind of people who were the fathers of the Reformation. And so what he did is he collected these documents and he made them available to people in the Greek text. And that was the authorized text. Now, they're pretty good, but remember, that was 500 years ago. And what we've done in the last 500 years is that now we have more people doing archaeology and more people thinking about this. Like, it would be great if we could collect all the oldest manuscripts and compare them with each other. One of the good things about comparing these 5,000 documents that we have of manuscripts is that we can see that there are very few differences between them. The differences that exist are what are called textual variants. Now, some of those are punctuation marks, most of them. Some of them are spelling. Sometimes it's a thing where a scribe wrote something wrong, then crossed it out and put his initials above it, to like you would if you were voiding a check or something like that. There's very few textual variants. Now, where there are some textual variants, one of the ways that happen is that as we collected older manuscripts, and by the way, it's not like we have one older manuscript. We have hundreds for a given passage or verse, right? We can compare those with what we know are later manuscripts, and we can say, oh, well, in the original manuscripts, these verses weren't included, or in the older manuscripts, because we don't have any original copies, right? So the older manuscripts, you can say, oh, well, these verses weren't included, but they are in the later manuscripts. So what does that mean? What it means is most likely, and again, here we're trying to intuit and do what's best. But again, the people doing this translation work, they're very smart people. And they're not just doing it on their own, by the way. This is always done in big teams of scholars at, reliable institutions. And so what they found is that most likely over time, some verses were added. Now, most of the time, the verses that are added, they are also found in other places in the Bible. So this is a perfect example here in Matthew chapter 17, verse 21. The verse in Matthew 17:21 is almost the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's almost the same as a verse in Mark chapter 9 where the same story is recorded. And so it seems that what happened is that scribes, seeking to be helpful, did a thing called harmonization. Harmonization is where you try to harmonize the Gospels and say, oh, well, Mark said this. Let's put it in Matthew's Gospel to help people get a bigger picture. We'll fill in the gaps. We'll do that, you know? And so they put it in here. Now, the numbering system that took place during the time of the Reformation. So that's why it'll skip a number by removing that. So here's the real question. Number one, have verses been removed from our Bibles that should be there? The second question then would be, or have verses been added to the Bible that shouldn't have been there in the first place? And you'll remember in Revelation 22, the last chapter of the Bible, there's this call from Jesus where he says, do not add or subtract from this revelation. So both are forbidden. We're not supposed to be adding nor subtracting. Now, sometimes I hear people talk about this, and maybe they don't understand why certain verses are removed, and here's what they'll assume sometimes. They might assume that there's a conspiracy, and the conspiracy is created by, let's say, maybe they would go so far as to say liberal scholars, or maybe they would say it's created not by necessarily liberal scholars, but it's pushed by publishers who have worldly agendas. Now, I think that's a real danger, and it's something that we should make sure that we don't allow. However, one way that you can know, okay, is that taking place? Because, and here's why. They'll say, well, you know, the NIV is put out by Zondervan. The NKJV is put out by Thomas Nelson, which publishes lots of things that are not Christian books, or explicitly Christian, or maybe questionable, right? They'll say the ESV is put out by Crossway. And they'll say, well, therefore, you know, these publishers have an agenda. And I don't know what it is, why they want to get rid of these verses, but it must be there, and we need to fight against this drift. And honestly, I think that is a very good concern. The question is that what is happening here? And here's why I would say I don't think that's what's happening here, is because if you look at the translations in other languages, for example, in Hungarian, we have a Reformation translation. It's called the Károli Bible. It actually predates the King James Bible by almost 100 years. One of the earliest Reformation Bibles. So the earliest Reformation Bibles, you're looking at the Luther Bible, and then you're looking at Calvin's French Bible. You're looking at the Geneva Bible. You're looking at some other early translations which actually predate the King James Bible. Because you remember the Reformation was met with opposition initially in England. There's a Tyndale Bible. I mean, these are all early translations. They're all based off of Erasmus's manuscripts. And so we have, going back to Hungarian, we have one of those, but we also have about 3 new translations. And those translations were not done by any publisher from the United States. They were done by the Hungarian Bible Society using scholars who knew the original languages and knew Hungarian, right? And this is true for many languages. And they are coming to the same conclusion. We're looking at the manuscripts. Has it been changed? Has it been altered? Our goal, our fidelity, is to the text as it was originally inspired by God. Now, I hope that makes sense for people, and I want you to know this. I read the New King James, and I quote the New King James in church, and sometimes the Old King James. I like it too. Again, the goal, how do we get closest to the original text? And if one translation is closer to the original text, then I want to go with that one.
All right. Very good. So, all right, last question, and this same topic, but for everybody watching, what's just a good apologetic response to a critic of Christianity, a critic of the Bible that would say the Bible is full of errors and it can't be trusted. It's not the same as the original. And you've touched on a couple things, but let's kind of summarize it into a response that somebody could give if they encounter that out in the world.
Okay, the quickest response you can do is say, show them to me. Tell me. Oh, there's so many of them. Tell me about one of them. Let's talk about it. And if it comes to a textual variant question, did you know that most of your Bibles probably have notes? Mine actually does. I'm looking at this one here's an ESV, yours is a New King James. And when you preach out of New King James. And that's we're not anti this or for
this
that.
has a note too for the same verse.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yours has a note that this verse is not found in certain manuscripts. Mine has a note that certain later manuscripts contain another verse that's mirrored from Mark chapter 9. If it's a textual variant question, then address that. Sometimes, though, a lot of these so-called, discrepancies are very easily resolved. I'll give you a quick one. There's one where it says in one of the Gospels that Judas went and hanged himself, but then it says in Acts that his body fell out of a tree and his guts burst open. And they're like, well, which one is it? Well, it's obviously both, right? Or I'll give you another example. It says that in one of the Gospels, it says there was one angel at the tomb of Jesus. Another one says there were two angels. And somebody said, well, one says one, the other says, well, no, actually you could say, well, there were two, but it just says that they talked to one of them, right? Just the other guy just didn't get mentioned in the story. It doesn't mean he wasn't there. And so almost every one of these can be easily resolved. And there's a good book like that, a book about this. It's actually no longer in print. Might have another name now, but you can still find it on Amazon. It's called When Critics Ask. I have a copy on my shelf right there. That is a great resource because it goes through every book of the Bible and actually says, okay, well, here's a thing that sometimes people will bring up as a contradiction in the Bible. And here's some options about how that can easily be resolved or why it's like that. And it deals with textual variants. I've got it. It's literally right there. Oh, When Skeptics Ask. Geisler and Brooks. Like I said, it might have changed the title or something like that. It's a great resource. You can find it on Amazon and other booksellers. But that would be my answer. Just tell me one and have a discussion about it. But you don't get away with saying blanket statements that you can't back up.
Yeah, sure. And that's what it a lot of times is, just a something that somebody heard and then they're just kind of repeating it, parroting that, criticism, and they don't really know whether that's true or not. So yeah. And the other thing, just I would say if you feel the question that you're not sure how to answer that, it's an opportunity then to go back and to look into it for yourself, and then you can ask the pastors at Whitefields. You can leave a comment in the section of the video if you've encountered something like that, and just say how do I respond to this, and we can help you. But it could just be an opportunity for you to do a little bit of homework and research and learn. And and so it's part of the growing process and growing in our faith, and and taking that mustard seed and seeing what it becomes. So that's how we're going to end today, and we appreciate you joining us and hanging out with us this whole time, and and just learning a ton. I mean, we went from here to here, and we got some good application and some good technical stuff. So if you liked it, please leave a comment, subscribe, hit the like button, and we'll see you next time.